Design Facebook's newsfeed. Hey everyone, I'm here today to do a system design mock interview with Jacob. I'm super excited to be here doing a system design interview question. System design interview questions often come up in software engineering and technical program management interviews. And I'm here today with Exponent's co-founder and CTO, Jacob. Jacob, you want to just introduce yourself really quickly before we get into the problem?
Hey, I'm Jacob. I'm the co-founder of Exponent. I work on all of our technology here, as well as a lot of our technical content like this. Prior to Exponent, I was a software engineer at Dropbox.
Awesome. And so as I mentioned, today we're going to be doing a system design interview question. And so Jacob, the question that I want to ask you about today is to design Facebook's newsfeed. And so I'd love to talk about the technical architecture, also some of the trade-offs that are involved with designing Facebook's newsfeed experience.
Okay, great. Yeah, I guess before we dive in, can I just get some clarification around what we mean by the Facebook newsfeed? Do you mean the sort of stream of content that I see when I go to facebook.com or open the app?
Yeah, exactly. So it's the newsfeed that you are familiar with, that the visual experience where you go to Facebook's homepage and you see, or the app, and you see the flow of content.
Okay. And are we more concerned about thinking about sort of the mobile experience or the web experience, or just sort of abstractly generating the feed itself?
Yeah, it's more about the abstract generation of the feed as opposed to specific platform implementation.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I think that's maybe enough to start, or I'll go ahead and jump into our digital whiteboard here, and we can sort of hash out some more of the details. So I guess as we're thinking about sort of designing the system that will generate this feed, how many users are going to be going through this? What should we sort of optimizing for? Are we at Facebook scale, for example?
Yeah, exactly. So for this problem, one of the most important things is thinking about scale, because Facebook does have a lot of users. So when we design this, let's think about how we can design it for a large set of users that will be experiencing the newsfeed.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, in that case, I would think about how can we build sort of a system, and what sort of services are we going to need, what components are we going to need to sort of break apart the system in a way that will allow us to scale it up to hundreds of millions or billions of users potentially, and what sort of principles are important to make that work. In this case, there's a lot of content on Facebook, a lot of new things being posted. Do we have any considerations, or how would you like me to think about how sort of fresh the newsfeed content should be?
Yeah, so it's definitely an aspect of the interview that we should touch on and we should think about, is the freshness of the feed. And you can fit that in when you need to in the interview, though. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's sort of a thing we can tune, but I guess being able to sort of be flexible about that is maybe an important point.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, I'm gonna sort of sketch out some basic components that we can use, or pieces that we can be thinking about as we build out the system. So in general, I mean, I think we can assume that we're going to have sort of a database ultimately that's going to store sort of our user content here. So we'll think about this as sort of we'll call this our metadata database. So this is going to store posts as well as information about users and who they follow. And we can sort of get into the schema of what that looks like a little bit later. But this is going to be sort of our main store for where we're sort of fetching this information. Obviously, at Facebook scale, it's going to be sort of a distributed database that's going to be sharded and is going to not necessarily have everything in one place, and it could be split among multiple databases. But let's come back to that. And then sort of on sort of the other side, we're going to have the user in their web browser, and they're going to sort of see a stream of content basically that will scroll down, and they'll be able to see new posts that are sort of coming up in their feed. And sort of the interesting part is the in-between here of like, how do we actually generate a good feed from the information that we have stored in the database from new posts that are being created. So the way I would think about this is we're probably going to want to have sort of a service or regular running job that's going to generate the newsfeed based on information we know about the user. So I'll sort of just draw this as sort of a black box for now and call this like the user feed service. So we can sort of think about that as sort of this black box that's going to do the work of sort of talking to the database and fetching the information that's pertinent to the user that we're thinking about. So this will be called sort of on a regular basis for a given user, a given active user. So given a user, it would go and fetch the followers, the like entities that this user is subscribed to, and then generate the feed, or maybe the top 100 items or n items at sort of this frequency interval that we were talking about before, the sort of rate of freshness that we care about. And then once it's done that sort of calculation, what we'd like to do is then actually sort of store this in sort of an intermediate cache that will allow us to sort of fetch this information a little bit more easily. So this might be, maybe something like Redis or something that sort of allows us to access this content in a more, just a faster sort of in-memory sort of rate, and then return that to the user when they make a request to our website. Does that kind of make sense so far?
Yeah, that makes sense. I have a couple questions. So first of all, just to, maybe a little bit more for the viewers also, but on the left, you're depicting a web browser. That could just as easily be a different client as well. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So I'll say this could be like a web or a mobile client.
Got it.
Yeah, and they'll be making sort of a request to the server. So either through a web browser or through the mobile app.
Cool. And then just my last other question on this is the cache. So what's the primary goal there? It sounds like the primary goal is to make it more expedient, but can you just describe briefly like how exactly that would make it a better experience for the user, the end user?
Yeah, exactly. So the important thing to think about here is that there's some degree of like calculation or fetching that we have to do that would probably just be too expensive to do on the fly when a user comes to our website or when hundreds of millions of people are visiting facebook.com. And so we need to be able to sort of pre-calculate this and store it, or that's one strategy for sort of optimizing the speed at which we can serve pages and reduce latency for the user, which is just a better sort of user experience and is going to reduce sort of the downstream load on our database systems. So that rather than pinging them every single time and sort of generating these feeds on the fly, we do it once at a certain interval or a certain rate. And then we can serve pages much faster and sort of reduce the load on our infrastructure.
Got it. Okay, cool. That was my second question. Thanks for explaining.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely, there's some missing pieces in here. So this might not be one service. This might be broken up into maybe a read service and a write service that would handle the job of sort of calculating this. And then we might have separate layers in here, like load balancers and different application servers that would handle other parts of our system beyond just this feature. But this is sort of a stripped down version of what that would look like. So we'll call this our feed cache, which will be writing and reading from when a request comes through. We'll return that request to the client, and then they'll render the feed or the first few items of it before then sort of fetching the remainder of the feed.
Got it. And so what would you be worried about as, let's say you're system designing this for a new Facebook competitor or a similar company to Facebook. Is there anything you'd be concerned about with this system design? Is something where it might break or it might produce an aberrant outcome for the end user or for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think yeah, we haven't really talked much about how the details of how the feed generation would actually work. And we can get into those details. But yeah, in general, I'd be worried, are these results consistent? Are they sort of what we expect to happen when a user, is it generating sort of the correct and most relevant feed, I guess? Like, and how do we sort of determine what sort of the right feed is? And are users going to be seeing sort of out of date or irrelevant content, or maybe content that they've like lost permission to or something like that? Like those are all sort of like edge cases in performance and security and relevance that we need to sort of be thinking about as we build this.
Got it. Can you pick one of those maybe and just walk me through that as kind of the last question of the interview then? Like maybe, let's say a
Yeah,
permission gets updated or something like that. You can pick the one that you want to dig into.
exactly. Yeah, I think that's a great example. So the way I would think about that is like, let's say a piece of content gets created, it gets sort of propagated into people's feeds and they begin to see it, but then the creator decides to delete or hide that content. They don't want it to show up anymore. This could cause an issue with our cache being basically invalid because it's showing content that users don't have permission to see anymore, or referring to content that no longer exists, which could cause an error. So the way I think about that is maybe there is a way in which we could invalidate the cache in a way that is sort of responsive to content that's being updated. So we could basically find the feeds in which this content is stored. And as soon as that content or some permission changes, we can propagate that and sort of overwrite the feeds that were containing that content, so that they're regenerated and no longer contain that. So that would be sort of, I think, the most direct way to do it. If we're okay with some sort of latency of those sort of changes propagating, then maybe it's okay. But yeah, that would be one solution.
Got it. And where exactly in this diagram would that happen, or where would the code live to kind of update that?
Yeah, I think that we haven't talked much about the code that would sort of maybe the service or part of the server that would handle the actual writing and updating of content, which would live here. So what we want to do is maybe when a piece of content is updated, we might also make a request between services to sort of kick off this regeneration process.
Got it. Got it. Okay, great. Is there anything else about this diagram that is worth talking about, or that you wanted to share before we jump to kind of final feedback and things like that?
Yeah, I would say this is like definitely not a complete, like fully baked system. There are definitely issues of scale and load that like we haven't talked about. Like, how do we deal with users who have millions of followers, or people who subscribe to very popular topics? How do we deal with those sort of problems of scale? But by and large, this is sort of a working sort of structure that you could use to build a system like a Facebook newsfeed.
Awesome. Okay. Great. Well, you can take a deep breath. You're done with the interview part. You can take your interview hat off, and we can kind of break and just talk about feedback and things like that. So before I jump into some of the notes that I wrote about how awesome a job you did in the interview, did you have any reflections, thoughts, comments on how the interview went for you?
Overall, pretty good. I think the sort of like, yeah, the principles we talked about all sort of make sense. I'm not sure if I conveyed them in the clearest way, or sort of did a great job of sort of walking you through and making sure that we were on the same page, or that I was talking about sort of and the aspect of the problem that you were most interested in hearing about. So there are a lot of different things we could have talked about in terms of how we generate the right feed, or getting into sort of the APIs there. But I think at a high level, I think we sort of covered our bases.
Awesome. Yeah. Totally agree. I think some things you did really well is that you structured your answer visually, which was really effective. The whiteboard tool was super effective. You clearly had a lot of expertise, and you demonstrated that throughout the interview. And you're ready to kind of jump on follow-up questions and use them as an opportunity to talk about interesting nuances. And I think that's really where the system design question interviews, the answers really excel, is when interviewee can talk a little bit more about the nuances of the system design architecture. It's one thing to be able to draw the diagram, but it's another to talk about, yeah, how does this permission thing affect the whole flow and how we think about that. So I thought that was really excellent. And then, yeah, I think, we're obviously doing this in this video format, but checking in with the interviewer more is always helpful. You did that once in the interview. It was really helpful because I had a couple questions to jump on. And then, yeah, just reminding viewers and watchers, like interviews are often kind of like a dance, and sometimes it's you have to figure out what your interviewer wants you to do or where your interviewer wants you to go. Um, and so this interview could go very differently depending on the scope, the scale, the level of detail that the interviewer wants the person to go into. So just be mindful of understanding the holistic system as opposed to memorizing or just coming in with like the exact system architecture of a particular problem. Cool. Well, any thoughts, reactions, or last comments from you, Jacob?
No, this is fun. Yeah, a lot of interesting problems like this. So it takes practice.
Cool. Well, good luck on your upcoming interview, and thanks for watching.